Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, Maurice. It's an enormous pleasure and privilege to give this lecture in memory of Darrell Ruttenberg, whom, like many others, I knew and had the pleasure of enormous amount of hospitality from him over the years in Scotland and elsewhere. And he was a wonderful man, and it's terrific that this lecture series has continued and kept alive his memory. David Cameron and Barack Obama said in a joint statement at the end of the President's recent state visit to London that the relationship between our two countries is not merely special but essential. Now, this was a pleasantly emollient assertion, characteristic of the things that statesmen say in such circumstances. But this evening I want to discuss how far it seems justified by realities, past and present, with special reference to defence, which is my field, and what we, the British, as ever the lesser player and often suppliant, might do to strengthen our side of the affiliation. Now, I use the word affiliation rather than partnership advisedly, for it seems to me that many of the difficulties and disappointments that landmark our exchanges with the United States result from exaggerated hopes of what Britain may realistically expect from its relationship with the most powerful nation on earth. Our two countries have some cultural affinities, if rather fewer than a generation ago, and individual British and American people often like each other very much. As an Englishman, I can aspire to a degree of intimacy with American friends that's hard to match with those of some other nations. But one of the commonest errors of the British, including sometimes their prime ministers, is to imagine that Americans collectively are like us. They are not. Most are no longer Eurocentric. Tens of millions are Latinos, more than a few of whom scarcely speak English. Newer and younger Americans' view of their own society and of the world is very different from ours. They have a sense of their own greatness, of their continent, which holds so much that it seems unnecessary to look much or often beyond it, such as Britain perforce abandoned long ago. To be sure, the rise of China has brought upon the United States, and especially its president, a new caution about the limits of the possible and apprehension about the economic future, which were hard to imagine 30 years ago. But today, America is still the world's sole superpower, as Professor Sir Michael Howard puts it, the only nation able and sometimes willing to get things done. One of the first and hardest lessons for some British people to grasp, even those at the heart of government, is how little attention we command among most Americans unless the chance is to be a royal wedding. Michael Howard is the repository of much wisdom on matters historical and strategic. I've always been struck by something he wrote years ago about the Anglo-American wartime alliance, a period when he was a fighting soldier. It is never very easy, he wrote, for the British to understand that a very large number of Americans, if they think about us at all, do so with various degrees of dislike and contempt. In the 1940s, the Americans had some reason to regard the British as a lot of toffee-nosed bastards who oppressed half the world and had a sinister talent for getting other people to do their fighting for them. In comprehending the wartime era, customarily cited as that in which the so-called special relationship was created, it's important to recognize how much mistrust and even antipathy persisted between the two peoples. I'll say more about this later, but for now it suffices to suggest that if most Americans are today much less wary of Britain than they were in our imperialist era, then this is because we don't loom so large and thus they think about us less. That also applies in the White House and on Capitol Hill. Britain scarcely registers on the consciousness of any but a handful of congressmen and senators, save as a theme park for agreeable vacations. A British ambassador in Washington said to me some years ago, "One of my jobs is to break to every British minister who visits here the unwelcome news that no, they won't be appearing on the Today Show or with Barbara Walters." But British governments care to the point of obsession about the United States and its administration's view of us, because many things that we want can happen only with American acquiescence or support. Whenever scepticism is expressed about Anglo-American relations, Prime Ministers respond with some pride and even complacency that if anything important happens in the world, one of the few personal calls that most US presidents make is to the tenant of Downing Street. This was so most recently between Barack Obama and David Cameron following the killing of Osama bin Laden. One of the Prime Minister's staff says, "China may have become the second most important country on earth, but that does not mean the President gets first on the line to President Hu, or for that matter, Prime Minister Putin. He wants to talk to someone he knows is on his side, and that is most likely to mean us." This is so. Few American chief executives share real intimacy with other national leaders, but it seems fair to speculate that Barack Obama feels as comfortable with David Cameron as with any foreign statesman with whom he does business. The President knows that Cameron and his government are both instinctively and fundamentally in the same camp. We want America and its rulers to prosper and to get their way in the world, as the Chinese and Russians frankly do not. But successive British Prime Ministers since 1941 have exposed themselves to rebuff and even humiliation when they've aspired to something beyond a comfortable accommodation on specifics, seeking to influence the policies of the United States and its leadership in directions they are disinclined to take. The British and US governments often find themselves on the same side, but when days come, as they do, on which America, and especially the Congress, wants something that runs against British wishes, it is dismaying to modern Prime Ministers, as it was to Winston Churchill, how seldom London's view prevails. The attitude of the British public towards the United States is more equivocal than that of most of their politicians. There have always been strands of economic envy and cultural condescension, periodically manifested in outbreaks of anti-Americanism. Such a surge took place at the height of the Ulster Troubles, when some Americans and even their government seemed remarkably indulgent towards Irish republicanism. There was tension before the 1982 Falklands conflict, when Secretary of State Alexander Haig appeared alarmingly sympathetic to the Argentine case, and nothing was known by the public about Defence Secretary Cap Weinberger's critical assistance to British war-making. More recently, substantial damage was done by Iraq. Many British people were angered that Tony Blair allowed Britain to become a party to George W. Bush's invasion, undertaken on what proved a false pretext. Moreover, American gratitude for British support, or even awareness of our participation, was muted. Among scores of American-authored books on the Iraq War published since 2003, scarcely any mentions British involvement in more than a few paragraphs or even sentences. The US security community has a high opinion of Britain's intelligence services, especially GCHQ, and enjoys a relationship with them entirely unique between America and other nations, which today forms the strongest single transatlantic link. By contrast, we sometimes flatter ourselves about American regard for our armed forces. These have shrunk very small. General Sir Mike Jackson, then head of the British Army, said to me back in the autumn of 2002, after a visit to Washington in the run-up to the Iraq invasion, "Mass matters, and we don't have it. The US Marine Corps' air wing is larger than the entire Royal Air Force." A senior British officer asserted optimistically a couple of years ago, "The Americans may not hold the British Army in very high regard just now, but they're hugely grateful for what our special forces are doing in Baghdad." This was a reference to the SAS's targeted assaults on al-Qaeda leaders. But the next time I was in Washington, I mentioned the General's remark to 7 or 8 Americans in the defense loop. Only one was aware of what the SAS had been doing. Now, of course, General David Petraeus and his close colleagues knew, but here was another example of the way in which the British may, in our own eyes, play a prominent role in an alliance military operation, but awareness of this amid the vastness of the United States, and even in its corridors of power, remains slight. Moreover, we should not fool ourselves that the United States Army thinks highly of our performance in Basra or in Afghanistan's Helmand province, because it does not. The question in all alliances, and especially the Atlantic one, is always the same. What do respective nations bring to the party? Outgoing United States Defense Secretary Robert Gates made an important and impressive speech in Brussels last month, in which he pulled no punches about the fashion and about his dismay and indeed scorn for the uneven fashion in which the Western powers' defense costs are being shared. The growing difficulty for the United States, he said, is to sustain current support for NATO if the American taxpayer continues to carry most of the burden. Between 2001 and 2010, United States defense expenditure rose from 305 to 693 billion, while that of the UK grew from 35 to just $56 billion. France pays $42 billion for defense, Germany 41, and Italy 20. The 2009 statistics, which haven't changed much since, show the United States spending 4.68% of GDP on defense, or $2,153 per capita. Britain only managed to exceed a notional 2% by smoke and mirrors use of accounting. That's the equivalent of $965 per capita and falling. France spent 2.5%, or $870 per capita, Germany 1.2%, or $580 per capita. Mr. Gates drew attention to the feeble showing in Afghanistan of some nations which grudgingly sent troops, but not to fight. He spoke of national caveats that tied the hands of Allied commanders in sometimes infuriating ways, the inability of many allies to meet agreed commitments. NATO has struggled at times desperately to sustain a deployment of 25 to 40,000 troops, not just in boots on the ground, but in crucial support assets such as helicopters, transport aircraft, maintenance, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, and much more. In Libya, said the Defence Secretary, similar shortcomings in capability and will have the potential to jeopardise the campaign. While every alliance member voted for the Libya mission, less than half have participated at all, and fewer than a third have been willing to participate in the strike mission. The mightiest military alliance in history is only 11 weeks into an operation against a poorly armed regime in a sparsely populated country, yet many allies are beginning to run short of munitions, requiring the United States once more to make up the difference. Some British people will here interject, but Bob Gates wasn't directing his fire at us. We've been doing our part manfully. It's the Germans and Italians and such like who were in his sights. Don't be so sure. If Britain's contribution and capabilities are indeed larger than those of other European nations, in Libya, as in Iraq and Afghanistan, our operations are viable only with American support. A British senior officer said to me recently that somehow we always seem to lack both the will or the means to finish the things that we've started militarily, to clinch a deal. Senior Americans are appalled by our planned defence cuts. They know that if the British Army shrinks as scheduled after withdrawal from Afghanistan, we shall thereafter be able to deploy only a single brigade group of 7,000 to 8,000 men for sustained operations overseas. This is not an impressive force, to put it politely, for a nation that prides itself on its military skills and warrior prowess. In making a broader judgment about Anglo-American relations, it seems useful to think carefully about just what allies are. It's unheard of in history for two sovereign nations to achieve concord across the whole range of policy. Countries become allies because they discover one, and occasionally a few more, objectives in common, and almost always these include a shared enemy. Marlborough in the 18th century led British and Dutch forces against the French, as did Wellington, British, Spanish and Portuguese troops 100 years later. Such relationships have always been highly fractious. I am a student of the Second World War. The extravagant rhetoric of Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill about the Grand Alliance causes some historians, even to this day, wildly to overstate the harmony and intimacy of their relationship. They're sometimes described as friends, and this seems completely mistaken. They created a friendship of state, which is something quite different. By 1944-45, the British, and Churchill in particular, had become privately angry and bitter at what they perceived as intolerably overbearing American behaviour towards themselves. I'll quote an example of just how tough Washington could be. In December 1944, there was hunger verging upon starvation in Italy and indeed all Europe. A British embassy official in Washington visited Assistant Secretary of War John J. McCloy to protest against the policy of monopolising pressure shipping to transport fantastically extravagant quantities of supplies to US forces overseas while liberated civilians were in desperate straits. In order to win the war, the British visitor demanded of McCloy, were we not imperiling the political and social fabric of European civilization on which the future peace of the world depended? His subsequent memo to the Foreign Office records, this drew from Mr. McCloy the immediate rejoinder that it was a British interest to remember that as a result of the complete change in the economic and financial position of the British Commonwealth which the war had brought about, we in the UK depended at least as much upon the United States as we did upon Europe. Was it wise to risk losing the support of the United States in seeking the support of Western Europe? This was what was involved. The shocked British official persisted in pressing the case for feeding Europe's civilians. But McCloy too stuck to his guns. He asserted that it would be fatal for Britain to argue that the war in the Pacific should be retarded in order that the civilian population of Europe should be fed. The Foreign Office in London professed acute dismay on reading the record of this meeting, but British impotence in the face of US dominance remained inescapable. That's only one example of the sort of exchanges which took place between the two Allied capitals in the latter part of the war, supposedly a halcyon era of Anglo-American relations. The Americans were in the driving seat. They knew it, and they were determined to impose their will. Brigadier Vivian Dykes of the British military mission in Washington wrote home, "We simply hold no cards at all, but London expects us to work miracles. It's a hard life." Curiously enough, at that time, the United States adopted a more indulgent attitude to the third party in the alliance, the Soviet Union. Until his death, Roosevelt harboured delusions about the working relationship that might be possible with Stalin, such as Churchill abandoned years earlier. One reason Stalin became the most successful warlord of World War II was that he understood with icy clarity something that often eluded the Americans and British. The three Allied powers were conjoined to defeat the common enemy of Nazism. But this in no way altered the fact that on almost everything else, their purposes were at odds. This applied also, if in lesser degree, between Britain and the United States. In 1940-41, before America became a belligerent, Washington insisted on payment of cash on the nail for every ton of arms and supplies shipped across the Atlantic until the British had exhausted their entire gold holdings and foreign investment portfolio, some of which had to be sold to US companies at fire sale prices. Churchill was appalled by this and wrote to Roosevelt on the 7th of December 1940, saying that if the cash drain continued, his nation would find itself in a position in which, after the victory was won with our blood and sweat, and civilization saved, and the time gained for the United States to be fully armed against all eventualities, we should stand stripped to the bone. Such a course would not be in the moral or economic interests of either of our countries. Roosevelt never responded to this point, and his evasion seems to me highly significant. The President identified a powerful United States interest in Britain's continued resistance and committed extraordinary energy and imagination to make public and congressional opinion recognize this, but not in Britain's post-war solvency. American policy throughout the war emphasized the importance of strengthening the US post-war competitive trading position vis-à-vis its ally, and indeed the terms of Lend-Lease imposed harsh constraints on, for instance, British civil aviation. The US was unflinching in shaping policy to do as little as possible to assist the preservation of the British Empire, a purpose which it deplored, with special emphasis on India. Growing awareness of this caused Churchill much dismay, though his belief never wavered that fostering the American alliance was a core purpose to which all else must be subordinated. He was assuredly right. An important element in the greatness of his wartime leadership was his understanding of the supreme importance of embracing the United States, in contrast to the stunning condescension displayed by most of his contemporaries among the British ruling caste. Compare Churchill's wisdom with the remark of Lord Halifax, who became Britain's Washington ambassador in December 1940. "I have never liked Americans except odd ones. In the mass, I've always found them dreadful." Lord Linlithgow, then Viceroy of India, wrote to Halifax to commiserate with him on his posting. "The heavy labour of toadying to your pack of pole-squatting parvenus. What a country, and what savages those who inhabit it." As for popular sentiment on both sides of the Atlantic, a not untypical poll in July 1942 invited Americans to say which nation they thought was trying hardest to win the war. A loyal 37% answered the United States, 30% named Russia, 14% China, 13% offered no opinion. Just 6% identified the British as most convincing triers. Conversely, a 1942 Gallup poll asked British people which ally was making the greatest contribution. Some 50% answered Russia, 43% Britain, 5% China, and just 3% the United States. In their hearts, British people knew that they could accomplish little alone, that only American resources were making possible Axis defeat. But it was sometimes hard to feel gratitude amid British consciousness that the struggle was reducing their own nation to penury while America grew relentlessly in wealth and might. Now, my point in all this is emphatically not to suggest that the wartime Anglo-American relationship was a sham or a failure. On the contrary, at an operational level, it proved the most successful military alliance in history. Professor Harry Nicholas has written that what was obtained was a much higher degree of cooperation and unforced fusion than had ever before existed between two sovereign states. It is merely that we are foolish to idealize it, to fail to recognize that it rested, and always will, not upon sentiment, but upon perceptions of respective national interest. It represented a contract to achieve a certain purpose in the 1940s, defeat of the Axis, rather than a marriage of minds between peoples or governments such as never could and never can be attainable. With the coming of the Cold War after 1945, the same remained true. The United States and Britain became the foremost players in the NATO alliance, a huge success story in shielding Western Europe against the Soviet Union. Close military and intelligence collaboration was superbly sustained through more than 40 years, and the latter especially continues to the present day. But meanwhile, on many other bilateral issues, tensions and differences persisted between Washington and London, as they must. What matters to justify the continuance of this, like any other alliance, is to identify a relatively narrow range of big things about which the two countries can agree, acknowledging that on many others they will not. And this seems as true in 2011 as it was in 1945. The phrase special relationship always seems a rather pathetic British conceit, which American presidents indulge as a courtesy, knowing that some of our politicians attribute to it totemic significance. It implies that we hope or even expect to receive breaks in Washington which other nations do not. Yet only in very rare cases does Anglophilia influence US behaviour. A conspicuous example was the military assistance rendered to Britain during the Falklands War, thanks to the personal enthusiasm of Caspar Weinberger, when much of the Reagan administration was sceptical about or even hostile to British purposes. In the normal course of business between the two nations, even if a president feels disposed to act helpfully towards some British interest, Congress and the rambling diversity of US government can remain stubbornly unaccommodating. A senior member of the Foreign Office said to me in some exasperation late in 2003, "We've stuck out our necks a long way to support the United States in Iraq, and this makes it pretty irksome that today, when there are 12 or 15 important bilateral issues under negotiation between Britain and the US, on not one is the administration helping us out." This shouldn't be a source of surprise, although it always seems so in Downing Street. Tony Blair was naive in believing that by joining George Bush's invasion of Iraq, he would gain leverage not only on that operation, but also in inducing the administration to exert more pressure on Israel for concessions to the Palestinians. The rule of the game, surely, is that Britain should wholeheartedly enter harness with the US in furtherance of any issue, operation, or purpose which seems deserving of support. But it's woefully mistaken to join an American enterprise or back a US policy against British instincts or interests merely in hopes of gratitude or payback from Washington elsewhere, because this is unlikely to be forthcoming. Perhaps the wisest action of Harold Wilson's otherwise undistinguished premiership was his refusal, in the face of immense American pressure, to commit British troops in Vietnam. It would seem rash to suggest that the two most recent shared Anglo-American military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan have been an unqualified success. This is not the place to discuss either in detail, but I suspect history will judge that in Afghanistan, having started by doing the right thing in evicting Al-Qaeda, we've ended up fighting the wrong war without much advancing either the struggle against international terrorism or the vast and intractable challenge of stabilizing Pakistan. A while ago, I heard a then Defense Secretary argue that the Iraq and Afghan interventions have been so unpopular here that they rendered it unlikely a British government could for years reconcile the electorate to another military adventure abroad. Libya suggests that he is wrong, although it's by no means assured that story will be concluded without tears before bedtime. And whatever happens there, and whatever the personal instincts and inclinations of presidents and prime ministers, it seems overwhelmingly likely the Western powers will again find themselves obliged to deploy forces abroad, because, as Charles Guthrie so sensibly observed, something always happens, and usually of a kind which, like Libya, nobody had previously thought of. The one certainty in Anglo-American relations is that if we wish to play our traditional role abroad in pursuit of any perceived important Western foreign policy objective, to enjoy America's confidence and share its secrets, we must own armed forces and intelligence assets capable of earning these things. If the European project had evolved as its founders hoped, long before today's date, a degree of defence integration would have been achieved which would have provided this continent with formidable, flexible and widely capable armed forces. As it is, not only do such forces not exist, but there seems no likelihood of their doing so in the future. NATO Secretary General Anders Rasmussen said in an important recent speech that the global order has more stakeholders than ever before, and yet very few guarantors. Europe is still one of them, but for how long? Although defence is and must remain the prerogative of sovereign powers, an alliance that brings Europe and North America together requires an equitable sharing of the burden in order to be efficient. At the current pace of cuts, it is hard to see Europe could maintain enough military capabilities to sustain similar operations to Libya in the future. Since the end of the Cold War, while the GDP of the European NATO nations has grown by around 55%, their defence spending has fallen by almost 20%. Meanwhile, in Asia, Indian defence spending has risen by 59% and China's has tripled. In 1991, NATO's European partners contributed 1/3 of the alliance's combined defence spend, while the US and Canada contributed the rest. Today, Europe's share has fallen to a pathetic 21%. It's not so much that most European countries have the wrong security policies. Rather, they have none at all. They address the issue with the Panglossian hope that if they do not take up arms against anybody else, with luck, no one will do so against them. The enfeebled condition of Europe's defences will be extraordinarily hard to remedy. It takes years, even if political will exists, significantly to expand a nation's armaments. It's impossible at short notice and in the face of unexpected crisis, rapidly to reinforce. Every power is obliged to take the field with what men, planes and guns it has on the day, and such strength in the case of Europe and indeed Britain is not impressive. And as Rasmussen says, hard power can enable peace, yet he also acknowledges that in the current economic and political environment, increased defence spending in Europe is most unlikely. His own solution to Europe's resource shortfall is that its nations should cooperate much more closely on procurement so that through a rational distribution of capabilities, the continent becomes capable of deploying credible forces. Yet for decades, this objective was founded on the rocks of rival domestic interests and frank absence of will in many European societies. No responsible British government could today make an agreement whereby its European partners would become responsible for, say, airborne surveillance or unmanned drone combat capability in a future deployment, because the risk is far too great that on the day, and for whatever reasons, the others simply would not be there. It must be right to pursue shared procurement and manufacturing wherever possible. But France is the only major European power with which the British can plan jointly for future warfighting contingencies with a reasonable expectation of commitments being fulfilled. Our two nations are the only ones which might be able to maintain armed forces capable of convincing Washington that Europeans can make a meaningful contribution to our common defence. This may be monstrously unfair to British and French taxpayers, but it's the way things are. If we want the United States to sustain a military commitment to Europe, the British, together with the French, must accept a disproportionate share of the burden, because there is nobody much else, and that is that. The British, growled Henry Kissinger a few years ago, are the last people left in Europe who like to fight. If this is not quite true, it's certainly the case that when we put our minds to it and commit the necessary resources, we can fight better than any other modern European nation. That superb US ambassador in London, Ray Seitz, observed 20 years ago that Britain was very foolish to cut its armed forces, as did the then Tory government, because these continued to command high respect and were the only asset which made possible what every British Prime Minister yearns for his country to do, punch above its weight. Britain always has a choice about whether to be a player on the global stage. It would be perfectly possible for us to carry on our national business with the relative passivity on supranational strategic issues of Germany or Italy. But every British government in modern times has opted for a major role abroad, and Libya suggests that David Cameron intends to continue to the tradition. Indeed, he showed himself determined to exercise a leadership role there, which the United States declines, and which many American policymakers in and out of uniform regard as an unwelcome diversion from their own national strategic priorities. Yet what seems to some of us remarkable is that our governments still demand power projection while being unwilling to fund armed forces of an adequacy which alone can give effect to our pretensions. Few modern politicians like defence. They know the electorate's not much interested, save at the crudest level of battlefield heroics. A century ago, during the great controversy about how many new dreadnought battleships should be built, every middle-class household in Britain understood, even if not all sympathised with, the slogan, "We want 8 and we won't wait." Today, debate about whether this country should build new aircraft carriers or buy joint strike fighters has been conducted within a tiny defence constituency and commands negligible understanding or interest in the country, the media and Parliament. The Ministry of Defence has an unenviable reputation for waste and incompetence on a scale that costs billions. Some service chiefs have crippled their credibility by pursuing big-ticket programmes which cost hugely but add disproportionately less to our usable forces. There is a respectable, though by no means conclusive case for replacing the Trident nuclear deterrent. But I am highly sceptical about doing so on a like-for-like basis because it seems almost certain that the price of doing so will be further to weaken our conventional capabilities, since the government is adamant that such a programme's cost must be borne without increasing the overall national defence spend. And this is certainly the view of RUSI researchers and other expert witnesses. All these things add up to a woeful failure spanning decades to adopt a credible national strategy, to which last year's Strategic Defence and Security Review added another ignominious contribution. The problem is unchanging. Paper commitments are preserved while resources to fulfil them are slashed merely to accommodate the latest and successive budget crises. Today, Britain's armed forces are almost threadbare. Not, it's true, by the standards of our European partners, but by those of preserving the capability to make a contribution to an Allied deployment overseas appropriate to this country's size, aspirations, and yes, wealth. If the Prime Minister is serious in wishing the United States to perceive our bilateral relationship as essential, then during the years ahead, it will be indeed essential to find cash to do more, not less. If present plans go ahead, substantially to cut the size of the army, this objective will be compromised, arguably fatally. If today it's a source of dismay to Washington that Britain is spending little more than a meagre 2% of its GDP on defence, in the years ahead it seems likely that a big political fight will be necessary to sustain even that figure. In the newspaper industry, we have a cynical saying that a journalist is as good as their last story. In international relations, an ally is worth as much as, and no more than, the resources, and specifically military resources, it is capable of contributing towards implementing a shared purpose by force or the threat of it. Robin Rennick was surely right when he wrote 15 years ago of the vital task Britain can fulfill to help ensure that the United States is not left alone to respond to crises in which the interests of the West generally are engaged. Yet, as Robert Gates says, If current trends and the decline of European defence capabilities are not halted and reversed, future US political leaders may not consider the return on America's investment in NATO worth the cost. In conclusion, I return to my earlier remark about the folly of seeking to inject sentiment as distinct from warm and proper courtesy into Anglo-American diplomacy, because this is a formula for grief. As in the past, so in the future. Our friendship will command as much respect in Washington as our standing as a nation in the world deserves, political, economic, and military. It is the responsibility of the British people, as well as of their government, to ensure that we earn this through the 21st century, recognizing that it will not come as a right or out of admiration for the colour of our eyes. Thank you very much.
Untitled Lecture. I know exactly what your lecturer was saying, what his point was, and what point he was everyone can take away from. I'll just summarise what he said in the last 2 minutes. This alliance with America, it's only going to work on the basis of resources. In that area, we are a woeful failure, ignominious threat then. So Max has very kindly said that he's going to take some questions on his point. Would everyone who wants to ask a question please do so, and please say your name. Let's go to the middle here first, please.
My name's Charlie Ramsey. You drew attention in your lecture to the decline of Britain's defence spending as a proportion of GDP and compared it to the increase in other countries. Given today's budget constraints, might an idea be to change the emphasis from increasing our defence spending to perhaps international diplomacy pressure to reduce defence spending elsewhere?
I'm afraid I think that the big mistake has been for successive governments to allow themselves to decide that because the electorate's not interested in defence, that a figure of 2% or a little more is an acceptable proportion of GDP to spend on defence. Bernard Grey, whom I don't know, but everybody speaks very highly of, who's now in charge of defence procurement, said at a big recent conference, he said to all the assembled military, you've got to get the message, there is no more money. There is a $38 billion black hole in the defence budget, and that has got to be somehow plugged, and there won't be any more cash to do it. Now, of course, in the present circumstances in which the country finds itself, that it is very difficult. One knows how the Treasury feels about all the special pleading. And also, the Treasury has good reason to be terribly angry with the Ministry of Defence because of the waste. And the waste has been colossal. But at the same time, I think the mistake has been to allow ourselves to become impaled on this idea that 2% and a little more is about the right proportion of GDP to be spending on defence. If we want to be the sort of nation that perhaps most of us in this room think that we should be, and certainly David Cameron appears to think that we should be, it is going to cost more, and it's no good pretending otherwise. Yes, one can save some money. I haven't forgotten, I hate to mention names in this context, but before the last election, I was having a conversation with Liam Fox, and I said, I do hope you realise that when you get into the Ministry of Defence, you're going to find yourself faced with a crisis of staggering magnitude, and big things are going to be at risk. And he said, oh, well, there's a tremendous amount of scope for efficiency saving. And I said, well, don't be silly. I mean, you might be on a good day to save 200 or 300 million by efficiency saving, but we're talking here about a colossal black hole. And the failure of the politicians, the practical politics of what you're saying is probably correct. I don't believe that a result of whatever those of this room may feel, or a result of what people like me say. I don't believe the will is there in Downing Street or in the government to find significantly more money for defence. But I think we therefore have to realise what the consequences are. In fact, I'll go a little bit further than I went in my lecture, that a veteran foreign policy guru, British, whom I respect greatly, sent me a long email today. I'll ask him to read the draft of my lecture. And he said, I think it's worse than you recognise. He said, I don't think we should take it for granted that American troops will be in Europe in 5 years' time. And I think American patience with our refusal to Europe's collective refusal to pick up their share of the burden, American patience is running very, very short. And we are just going to have to make some very hard decisions, recognising that the Germans and the Italians aren't going to get us out of this problem.
Stay there, stay there. Let's, yes, in the middle again.
Sorry, I was just, could I perhaps rephrase my questions? Do you think that international pressure on countries who could conceivably be considered a threat is great enough, or do you think that that's an impractical approach?
Are you suggesting we should be seeking to achieve more by diplomacy and less by force? That's certainly a very popular view in German universities, but I'm not quite sure that I'm not quite sure that it's a view that, by and large, there usually comes a moment at which somebody has to at least wave a big stick, if hopefully not use it. I'm afraid I don't place much faith in the world becoming a better place.
Towards the back end.
Bernard Herman, thank you so much for an excellent lecture. And if I may respectfully suggest there were two omissions in your lecture. The first is that whilst you refer to the bilateral relationship between Britain and the United States itself clearly is in relative decline, if not absolute decline in the world, and its relationship with its allies, or those who perceive its allies, certainly among the knowledgeable elite in Washington, will somewhat be influenced by the fact that they know that they are in relative decline. And furthermore, you haven't once mentioned Britain's membership of the European Union, except in passing.
I didn't think you wanted to be here all night.
No, I certainly don't think that, but surely it is the issue of a compromise of sovereignty if Britain does seek to have a close relation with the United States and at the same time is a member of the European Union.
I think it is fair to recognise, I was reading an excellent article in the IISS journal a week or two ago on the subject of where Europe has been, or where Europe has not been through successive recent crises. And those of us who, 20 years ago, I would have called myself, I never wanted us to join the Euro, but 20 years ago, I would have called myself a broadly pro-European. And I would never have guessed in my wildest imaginings just how totally unfit for any common purpose Europe has proved to be.
Max, on the point about American decline.
Sorry,
American decline.
American decline. Well, this is part of the American decline problem is their enormous budgetary problems. That there is no question, as we know, and that the administration has made explicit that America is going to face major military budget cuts, and where this takes them is a very debatable point. But one thing I do know from my own conversations with the American military that in the years ahead, if they're forced to narrow the range of threats and issues they can deal with, then their priorities will unquestionably be on the other side of the world. I mean, obviously, the very important ones, Iran, will remain a very big issue. But as far as actually defending Europe goes, I think you're going to find it very difficult in as you absolutely rightly say, a more difficult budget climate in Washington, to find much support for doing anything other than trying to save money as far as US role in the defence of Europe.
Where am I going around the room? On the right here.
I'm Henry Keswick. Is there not a source of income to boost your ideas on defence spending by reducing our overseas aid spending, which we are increasing substantially?
Well, I'm sure most of us in this room would totally agree about that. It was one of the incomprehensible aspects of government policy to declare this commitment to I'm not against the whole idea of having an overseas aid program, but to be spending as much as we are on overseas aid while facing the huge difficulties we are. I mean, I haven't even had time to touch on tonight some of the horrors that are going on in the Ministry of Defence and the Armed Forces, and the pathetic squeezes of things. Some of you may not have heard of boarding school allowance, but I can tell you at the moment, if you mention to a senior officer boarding school allowance, this is one of the latest economy measures which is being undertaken in the Ministry of Defence, and the effect on keeping the calibre of promising officer that we would hope to have in the armed forces in 10, 20 years, I cannot overstate the impact it's going to have on good people leaving. And yes, when I think of the huge sums being spent in overseas aid, not least to India, a fraction of which would might make it possible to take boarding school allowance off the current budget cuts agenda, well, of course, Henry, I agree totally.
Thank you very much. Where am I going now? Here in the second row, please.
Naturally, there's a bit more to the relationship than money and spending money. And isn't there a moral identity between us and America? I mean, love of democracy, love of freedom, the intention and the ability to fight for it, which is not shared to such a degree by other countries in Europe, let alone Russia and China and Japan. So, I mean, there's something more there, there's heart in this, as well as cash.
No, one would unhesitatingly say that the attachment to freedom and democracy is obviously one of the big things which keeps the relationship going. But my real point, what I do think is important for us to recognise is just how low we feature on the American agenda at the moment, in terms of sometimes we have expectations of how much attention Americans are paying to us that I think are unrealistic and we're very foolish to harbour. But of course one agrees that the shared commitment to freedom and democracy is one of the big things that has kept a relationship together.
I'm over here now, on the middle of the
Well, I'm an American, and
Tell us your name.
I'm Bruce McGeller. I'm from New York, and spent 4 years in the military. 2 of those were on the staff of Secretary of Defense in a group called Systems Analysis. And so I know a little bit, probably to be dangerous with it. I think you got one part right, you got one part wrong in my analysis. First part.
That's a better average than I usually manage.
The first part is, I think it is driven by budget. We are, I won't say we're broke, and when you have to cut back, you're going to really have to cut back in the military. I mean, this compromise that is going down right now that happened within a month, you're going to have to really cut back on the military. I don't agree. I agree with your politics. I'm just reading what your group is all about, and I really think I'm for you all the way, in the way that I'm on the other side of the house than the current one that's in the White House. But the part that so it is a reality that they just don't have the money, and that in order to, NATO it was a sentiment a long time ago that we wouldn't have the money for NATO, and now we just don't have it. And so I think it's a fact of life that you're going to have to cut this budget back. I think the thing that you've got wrong is the attitude of the American people toward the British, because I think there's an incredible, now this is totally unofficial without any statistics, but there's an incredible admiration and great admiration for what you did in the Second World War. I think you're a little bit dour about we're going to have to take the money away, and you're sort of pouting and saying, they're going to take our money away and they don't like us anymore. I don't think that's true at all. So that's the part that I think you got.
I think if I may venture to say so, I think that you're speaking for a generation that was Eurocentric, and I'm thinking about the new America, a large part of which I'm not quite sure that that you would suggest share values, that there's a new America coming up in the same way there's a new Britain coming up, which is rather different from the old one and comes at things different ways. But sure, I mean, East Coast Americans of a certain generation had an enormous amount in common in us, which I would suggest that grape pickers in California nowadays do not.
In the middle, please. And take one more question off that.
Do you think the relationship is complicated by the existence of Israel and the Middle Eastern crisis?
Gosh, That's another one that threatens to keep us here longer than most of you would probably wish to be. I think the answer has to be yes, that it's a very difficult one. But I don't really think one wants to start going over that hole. But it is certainly true, I would have thought, that the Western Alliance pays a high price for the strength of American support for Israel. But the merits of that, I think, are beyond this this debate.
I'm going to take a last question. If I don't see a hand, I'm going to take it. Okay, there you go.
James Harris, we've been talking about a number of topics: security, economics, morality, liberal democracies, and it seems to me that you put it all together by noticing that the US and the UK have a lot in common in terms of being liberal democracies and so on. They're both running huge fiscal deficits at the same time as they are cutting defence. It seems to me that this is really an expression of the fact that politicians have sought to bribe their own electorates with their own money to the detriment of more difficult questions, including defence. Until we address, perhaps you could describe that failure of leadership, then how we then dole out the money becomes almost a secondary issue.
Well, one of the things that makes me despair is if you ever take a look on television when there's a defence debate in the House of Commons and you see how thin the House is, that generally speaking, defence is just not an issue. That politicians are always asking of all parties, and they have now that virtually no front branch politician has personal military experience, they're always asking a simple question. Are the votes in it? And they don't see votes in defence. And it's getting the hardest struggle that some of us try terribly hard to do whatever we can to help. But to get any part of the public, never mind the body politic, to focus on these issues. And there's room for an enormous amount of debate about the nitty-gritty of what we do or don't do. But it's the insouciant manner in which a lot of these unbelievably crass decisions. I mean, I was having a conversation with a senior army officer last night. He was just saying, what is extraordinary is that the government allegedly wants to get things done to reform the Ministry of Defence and to get the armed forces on a new footing. But he said getting any sense or any decisions out of anybody, getting them to actually agree things. And as soon as you mention, for instance, cutting some barracks in Scotland, well, they say, oh no, we can't do that. It might cost a few votes in Scotland. Not that the Tories, the coalition, got any votes, or the Tories have got any votes in Scotland. But it's the level of indifference as well as incompetence with which defence has been handled by all parties in recent years. That is really what one is seeking to focus people's minds on. It's much more even, we can go beyond that after that and have a discussion about the detail of what we should be doing. But at the moment, we're just blundering on, cutting a bit here, cutting a bit there. And I have to say, morale in the armed forces at the moment is very low because they do not have confidence in the people who are running them, and they do not have confidence in their own future. And those of us who care passionately about the armed forces and care passionately about defence are terribly angry about it.
My friends, I think we've had a marvellously clear exposition of the point of view, and I hope it's one which everyone here will take up. If you wanted to hear a visual description of what politics should be, I think you've just heard it. Will you join me in congratulating Sir Max on a magnificent lecture?